Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. And today we're going to talk about Pax Londinium, which is a sourcebook for Liminal. Liminal is an RPG. Let's show you that cover real quick. That is kind of an indie RPG that is urban fantasy, similar to a lot of the other ones we've talked about, like Dresden Files Accelerated, and urban fantasy. It's the modern world, but there's magic and there's werewolves and there's, ghosts and vampires and all this sort of thing. Liminal is a really intriguing one that has really beautiful artwork in it, and is set very specifically in the UK. And this source book is just a guide of how to run your games, how to set your games in London itself. And it is full of a lot of really good London information. So let's dig into it here. You can see it's kind of a little taller and skinnier than a lot of these games are. So it starts, first of all, with a discussion of your London. What is your London like? And a lot of these city source books, something like Chicago by Night, for example, will get very specific. And, they will show you their version of London. I really like the way that this allows you, or kind of gives you permission, I guess is a better way of saying that, to just make up your own version of London. Whether you are a London native who's lived there your whole life, or someone who lives outside of it and only goes in to visit for work or for holidays or something, or whether you're like me, a tourist who's been there 3 or 4 times total, or maybe you've never been to London at all, but you've just seen it in movies or television. Whatever your London is, you can make up your own version of it. And your experience with London is going to affect the kinds of things that you do, the kinds of stories that you tell, and the kinds of elements that you include. If you are purely a London tourist, then your London is going to have probably a lot of big landmarks and a lot of, supernatural goings on with stuff like Big Ben or the Eye or the Tower of London and all these sorts of kind of famous tourist sites. If you are a longtime native, maybe your London has more to do with, kind of the small town, the row houses, the outskirts of London, or the kind of grungy fish and chips shop underneath a road, things like that. It also makes sure to go into some of the really famous London-based stuff. Do you want to include elements of Jack the Ripper? Do you want to try to, focus your version of the story more on something like Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, which is very clearly a supernatural version of London? Or do you want to go in a wildly opposite direction and do something like Bridget Jones' Diary, which is also a version of London? Any of them can work, and I like that a lot. So let's jump into Chapter 2 very quickly. First of all, I do just want to give another shout out to the art. I think the art in this book is just beautiful. They spent their art budget wisely, let's say that. So, what are some themes about London? London is both a huge city and a smaller one. It's one of the largest and most populous cities in the world, one of the most diverse cities in the entire world. And there's a lot going on. It's a city in motion, but not necessarily quickly. If you've been stuck in traffic there, or in the stupid highway that runs around the outside of it, London wears its history on its sleeve. I remember the first time I went to London, I went to the Westminster Abbey, of course, and, wandered around Poets' Corner and things like that. But then they had parts of the Abbey open that you could just walk into the back, kind of less populated parts of it. And, because it is like an actual functioning church. And I saw this little sign that said, just little black sign that said, England's oldest door. And I can't remember the exact age, but it was from the year like 815 or 852 or something bananas like that. Which, coming from not only the US, but the Western US, which has been populated for, by Europeans, I should say, for about 150, 170 years, the idea that this door has been hanging there for, what is that, 1,200 years? That's astonishing to me. A few days later, I went to a pub that said, established in like 1480 or something like that. People could have eaten there before hopping in the ships and sailing across the sea with Columbus in 1492. That's bananas. Again, London is an old city, but it's also an incredibly new city at the same time. And so these different themes, there's a lot to work with. It has incredibly modern architecture and a lot of kind of modern energy and ideas and populations and cultures, while also being very ancient in a lot of ways. So hooray for that. London is also a city of the hidden, and this is where we get into some very Neil Gaiman Neverwhere kind of ideas. The fact that, or rather I should say the idea that London is full of supernatural stuff and people who are so strange and so mystical that most people just don't even notice them. That there's kind of a magic Teflon over our awareness, and we can't even see these people, and we are not aware of them as we go by. And then it talks about the Pax Londinium itself. Pax, of course, being a Latin word for peace. That there is a peace being enforced in London between magical and mundane people. And it's an interesting treaty. It's an interesting idea. Anyway, let's move on to chapter 3. This is where we get to the factions of this world. And there's a lot in here. And like it said in the beginning, your London can be different than everyone else's London. You can pick and choose which of these you think are fascinating. And the way each of these are presented, there's a little bridge troll, is, they'll have a name, Council of Merlin, some little fiction, describe what they do, and then kind of describe some of the ideas or ways that this faction could be involved, and then give some stats using the liminal system that you have to watch my other review to find, of a person that you might, one or two people in some cases, that you might run into. So the Court of the Queen of Hyde Park, it has all these stats for boggarts, and then stats for the Duchess of Bridges, the Lady of Flowers, and then here's some little rules if you want to use some river spirits doing something. And so it goes on like that. There's several of these factions, and some of them are older and some of them are newer. Let's talk about P Division, because their goal is to enforce that peace, the treaty between magical and non-magical stuff. And in this is one of the campaign structures that most stands out to me as I read through the book, is wouldn't it be cool to be like the opposite of the X-Files? And kind of like the Men in Black, but without the flashy thingy, the neuralizer, where your job is to go around London covering up evidence of supernatural activity. If there's a monster or a wizard or whatever it is causing trouble, or being embroiled in trouble because amateur ghost hunters are actually finding a real ghost, and then your job is to go out and stop them. That's what P Division does. It will cover up all of those different things, which I think is a really neat idea. Now, a few more factions. The Knowledge is a group of taxi drivers. The idea that a significant portion of London taxi drivers are all actually manifestations of something called the Knowledge. And this is why when you get into a cab in London, there's a good chance that it is going to be driven by kind of a short pudgy British man who seems to know absolutely everything about the city. That's the city itself manifesting through this network of kind of hive mind cab drivers. I love that idea. It's such a cool idea. The Hidden, they name drop Neil Gaiman in here because Neverwhere was such a clear and obvious, inspiration for The Hidden. And I described what The Hidden are already. And then the Guild of Water and Light. There's the Guild of Tunnelers, who are the people who kind of dig sewers and tube lines and things like that. Anyway, let's get into chapter 4, because the next 3 chapters are different kinds of stories that you can tell. Chapter 4 is all about mystery. This is a city of mysteries. And so most of what this is here are... These are plot hooks, basically. An entire 3 chapters of plot hooks. These are all about mysteries based on... some of them are come from London history, from some actual things. Some of them are from folk tales. Others they just made up out of their own heads. There's a lot of really interesting ideas here, which are a lot of fun to play with. And I won't go into them, so your game master can use them. Chapter 5 is the same thing, plot hooks, but dealing with death and undeath. And so this is where we get stuff like the plague pits. These are real things, real. You can go on the internet and look up, like the plague pits of the London Blitz, or not the Blitz, the Black Death. And there's a lot of rumors that somewhere underneath London, there's all of these, mass graves from the Black Plague. And there are, you're probably already spinning off ideas of, oh my gosh, what could I do? What amazing stories could I tell with these mass Black Death graves underneath the city? Are they haunted? Are they still poisonous? Is the plague going to get out? Are there people in there who are being disturbed by modern construction? Is there a portion of the underground that runs through what used to be a mass grave and is still haunted, and people tend to get sick when they go through there? There's a lot of cool ideas that you can do with all of this stuff. So, chapter 6 is about gods and goddesses. Plot hooks based on religion. And not just any one. Like I said, London is an incredibly multicultural city. And so they've got, by the way, fabulous art, this one as well. They've got some stuff like, Vortimer and Vortigern. If you remember Vortigern, he was the guy who was like the bad guy in the very early King Arthur stuff. He was, took the crown away from King Uther, who was Arthur's father, and eventually they wrested it back from him. Bran the Blessed is more of a Celtic thing. Then we have all these different kinds, and then we even get into powers from around the world. Now, one thing that Britain has done throughout its long history of imperialism and colonialism, they have taken artifacts from all over the world and brought them in. And so if you want to have Greek gods or Egyptian gods in your London story, you can, because they've stolen a ton of Greek and Egyptian artifacts from their home countries and brought them, and now they display them in the museums and stuff. So there's a lot of really interesting ideas. There's a huge Chinatown in London that you could play with. There's a lot of different ideas. Anyway, then we get to chapter 7, which is where we start talking about encounters. And so these are, rather than just pure plot hooks, these are locations and people. And they range from, the very simple. This very first one here, Ahmed's VHS Wonderland, is a VHS store that sells tapes, but in fact actually has much more interesting stuff going on. Sells a lot of liminal, which are, mystical artifacts. And then there's all these different things that I just find delightful that you can run into. If you want to put your players, they need a place to eat or a place to go shopping or whatever, here's a bunch of ideas. So, chapter 8 is mostly just some sample characters, kind of showing what the character creation system is capable of. And so there's a little bit of a backstory here about how the crew is organized and what they do and what they're interested in, and then you've got stats for them. And this isn't as useful because something like this already exists in the core book, but the person who wrote this book didn't write the core book and wanted to put his own little people into it. So there's nothing wrong with that. Chapter 9 adds some new rules, the most interesting of which is a new kind of magic. The core book has several different kinds. This has a new one called chronomancy, and then that's where we get to the end. That's the whole book. I really like this. The liminal line in general is just a really good modern fantasy RPG. Does a good job of capturing that, Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere kind of feel to it. The idea that there is a world beyond our world, that there are spaces that are mystical or arcane or simply weird and otherworldly that we encounter and that we move through. And if you want to play a really great indie RPG about that kind of modern fantasy stuff, Liminal is a wonderful one, and I recommend it, and I really recommend this. You can, whether you've ever been there or not, whatever your London is, this book can help you create a game setting using London as a base. So, there you go. Thank you very much for watching. My name, as mentioned, is Dan Wells, and I'm an author. I've got 19 books published. You can read them all. There is a link down below where you can learn more about it, or you can just look me up on Amazon or something. I also am a professional game master. I can run a game for you and your friends, including, if you are interested, Liminal or something like it. I encourage you to click all those links, check this book stuff out, and definitely look into Liminal as a game, because it's a really beautiful, well-done system that, because it's so small and indie, a lot of people haven't heard of. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. My name is Dan Wells, and you are awesome.